Hello, everyone. Welcome to our very first lecture of the semester. We'll be covering Conley's Chapter 1 on the sociological imagination and other foundational concepts and people in sociology. So, what are our learning objectives for this chapter? We're going to describe what the discipline of sociology studies and define the sociological imagination, describe how it makes the familiar strange, as Mills put it. We'll talk about social institutions, explain what they are, and how to think about them sociologically. And with that, we'll explain the concept of social identity. We'll talk about the sociology of sociology by describing the relevance of some of these early scholars and what their perspectives were and how they contributed to the field of psychology. We'll talk about, along with continuing to talk about the sociology of sociology, we'll talk about the Chicago School, which is probably the most well-known American um, area of psychology, and describe different approaches and terms introduced by individuals. We'll talk about sociology and its cousins, meaning disciplines that are related to sociology and what makes sociology distinct from those other disciplines. Finally, we'll talk about divisions within sociology, and more specifically, some of these general frameworks that have been used to move sociology forward as a discipline. And so we can begin by describing what sociology is. So, sociology is the study of human society and social groups. Social groups being things like the family, a sports team, school, country, um, and even language. More specifically, sociology studies the development, structure, and functioning of human society. Sociologists study the influence that society has on people's attitudes and behaviors that seek to understand ways in which people interact and shape society. By observing and understanding, we can make predictions and discuss probable relationships. And so, in thinking about the sociological imagination, a concept that C. Wright Mills introduced in 1959, um, he argued that we need to use our sociological imagination to think critically about the social world around us. The sociological imagination being the ability to connect one's personal experiences to society at large and greater historical forces. Using our sociological imagination allows us to make the familiar strange, as he said, or to question habits or customs that seem natural to us. Um, for example, in the book, he describes from the movie Pulp Fiction, which I haven't seen, um, Samuel L. Jackson's character talks about his experience in Europe and how he thought it was very odd that Europeans eat their fries with mayonnaise. So in the US, we typically eat our fries with ketchup. And so to him, this was really weird and out of the ordinary. Now, that might sound like a silly example, but that's a good way to think about the sociological imagination. If you were to step in another culture, in another area, people that are intrinsically different than you, just culturally different than you, what are some of the things that you would think, well, this is weird, this isn't how we typically do it or what I'm used to. In thinking about the sociological imagination, Mills also describes private troubles and public issues. Private troubles, as the name suggests, are circumstances that are unique to individuals, whereas public issues are obstacles that many individuals in a society face. A good example of that is unemployment. Someone might be unemployed, and that is an example of a private trouble. Now, in instances of economic downturn, like we had at the beginning of COVID, we might have a large number of people who are unemployed. And suddenly this becomes more of a public issue or a social problem that needs to be addressed. And so most things aren't one or the other. Most things can straddle both of those. And so most of the problems we encounter are a mix of both. And now thinking about social institutions, and social institutions are groups of social positions that are connected in their relationship and that perform a social role. Social institutions can be something like the legal system, the labor market, or even language itself. And they can have a great influence on the behaviors of individuals who make it up. The interactions and meanings we ascribe to social institutions shape and change them, meaning that social institutions are not static, but they change over time. You can think of it as a feedback loop. Social institutions mandate how individuals within it should interact, how they should behave, but individuals within the social institutions can behave in ways that change what the social institution is. Um, in our book, we had an example of, for example, universities. Universities, um, students at a university have typical roles that they must fulfill, um, uh, different ways in which they must interact with each other. That's pretty set in stone. That's a social institution. Now, a university can change up some of those dynamics by uh, just being influenced by the particulars that are making part of that institution. So you may have students, professors, staff at an institution that call for a certain type of change, let's say changes in policy, and that can result in the institution itself, the university, changing its rules, its policies. And so that is to say that while individuals are heavily influenced by the social institutions which they make part, they can also lead to change in these institutions. Now, social identity is more on the personal level. Social identity is how individuals define themselves in relationship to groups that they are part of, or groups that maybe they're not part of. We all contribute to one another's social identity, which can also be thought of as a grand narrative constructed of many individual stories. So, for example, I am an American male in my late 20s. I am a son, a brother, a grandson, a college professor. I have all these experiences in my past, and all these roles that I am a part of. Um, and these have specific ways of behaving, of interacting. We know um, how, let's say, a male in their late 20s is supposed to interact, some of the milestones that we meet by our late 20s. These are things that we that we're introduced to that are just reinforced by society at large. At the same time, you and I have something in common. We're both in this classroom. We're both part of the educational institution that is UMBC. And so while we have these individual social identities that are composed of, let's say, multiple pieces of who we are, we can think of it as pieces of a puzzle. And this broader puzzle being your social identity and how it's made up of both your past experiences and your current experiences and the roles that you fit in society. And so the different groups that you belong to help tell stories about your identity. By meeting you and knowing that you're a student, I immediately have some preconceived notions about what it is you do, how you do it, um, and things of the sort. And so, shifting gears a little bit to the origins of sociological thinking and sociology in general as a discipline. So, we can start thinking about the scientific revolution as being one of the catalysts leading to sociology developing into a discipline. And the scientific revolution, or Age of Enlightenment, emphasized the individual's possession of critical thinking, individualized thinking, and really stepped out of this religious framework that we had previously, where individuals were thought to be part of a broader scheme, and had no ability to make personal decisions and think critically for themselves. The scientific revolution really presented a movement towards scientific research and ultimately led to the social sciences and sociology. Now, we had the Industrial Revolution, and the Industrial Revolution was this huge transformation of going from mostly agricultural societies, individuals living in rural areas and depending on farming, to industrialization, or the dependence on handmade products and an emphasis on manufacturing and related industries. And with this, we had urbanization come around, and urbanization was this movement, this influx of people moving into close proximity, um, and ultimately form what we know as cities, moving out of rural areas, coming together to work in these factories, um, and so this had a huge influence in the way we thought about social interactions, and some of the problems that led to that. As a result of industrialization, more and more people moved to cities to find work, and have higher wages in factories. And this really created a lot of social problems. Thinkers of that time started to critically look at the social problems created by industrialization and urbanization, resulting from individuals, groups of people moving into these urban cores. And essentially, they were studying sociological phenomenon to reflect on lower wages, harsh living conditions, child labor, women's position in society, and the rich getting richer. So, this was a time when thinkers really began to see what some of the conflicts resulting from vast numbers of people with different backgrounds coming together into um, contained areas working in the same environments, and what the issues surrounding that were. Um, and so now we've moved to this era of postmodernism. And that's really the modern theories, and how they've been unsuccessful in explaining social life in contemporary society, which are characterized by post industrialization, consumerism, and global communication. There is a corresponding rise of a consumer society and global village. We are no longer tied to these to cities, to urban pockets and areas that are geographically close to us. But now we have these technologies. We have the internet where we can interact with people from across the globe, and this really creates a new level of socialization, a new series of social problems resulting from just so many people from different cultures, backgrounds, social roles within so many social institutions coming together, and for the first time communicating. And so, thinking about the history of sociology, and we'll go through several individuals and what their contributions to sociology were. So first we have Auguste Comte, and he's considered the father of sociology. He thought that sociology was better understood by determining the logic or scientific laws governing human behavior. He called it social physics or positivism. According to him, um, he theorized about social statics and social dynamics. And according to him, just the way we study physics, one of the natural sciences, we can study social life scientifically. And this was a revolutionary idea that we can study human behavior and human interaction, much like earlier thinkers were studying natural phenomena in the natural sciences. And so he thought we could apply these systematic research methods, which we'll get to in chapter 2, to study sociology and to study society overall. And so this is a hint to you. You should know what this term means. And then moving on to Harriet Martineau. She was the first person to translate Comte's written work into English and was one of the earliest feminist social scientists. She analyzed the consequences of industrialization and capitalism. She paid special attention to diversity in the US based on race, class, and gender. And she was an advocate for racial and gender equality. Some scholars have even argued that she should have been the founder member of the discipline of sociology rather than Comte. I apologize. Okay, then we have Karl Marx, which many of us are familiar with. He developed the theory of historical materialism, or the production and consumption of material products, which identifies class conflict as a primary cause of social change. Now, this is really important. He viewed class conflict as a struggle between members of the capitalist class or bourgeoisie and the working class or proletarians. He believed that the exploitation of workers by capitalism resulted in alienation of the working class or a feeling of powerlessness and entrenchment from other people and oneself. He believed that economic factors were really the one force behind social change. And so while his theories didn't fully pick up, um, we now understand that a lot of social inequalities do exist, and we could use his framework to think about those social inequalities. Then we have Emil Durkheim. He is the founder of positivist sociology. Just like Comte, he proposed that sociology can be studied scientifically, or using the positivist approach through social facts. He used statistics to develop the theory that division of labor helps to determine how social cohesion is or is not maintained by society. Social cohesion meaning the integration of people from different groups into one unified group. He established sociology as an academic discipline, which is key and is why you are in this class today. His, his ideas contributed to the theory of structural functionalism, which we will talk about later on in the course. Um, Durkheim also understood the impact of the division of labor or how we organize work, and how that was a major part of societal problems. And so this is reminiscent of Marx's idea, but Durkheim took it in a different approach and actually picked up more interest from the scientific community with his idea of positivist um, sociology. Then we have Max Weber, and he had an emphasis on subjectivity, and that became the foundation for interpretive sociology. He believed that it was difficult to use standard scientific methods to accurately predict the behavior of groups of human beings, and that culture and human psychology affect human decisions in a way that science cannot predict. He disagreed with Marx's idea that the economy was a central force behind social change, and he really believed that it was religion that was behind social change and um, the social change that they were observing at the time. He examined the role of religion as a social change in his book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. Weber was also concerned by the interactions of wealth, power, and prestige as determinants of social class. However, he had less emphasis on that aspect of it, and he believed more in religion driving human behavior and human socialization. And then we have George Simmel, um, who developed formal sociology or sociology of pure numbers. His ideas contributed to the development of critical theory and an expansion of conflict theory. Critical theory attempts to address structural issues causing inequality. For example, critical race theory identifies and resolves policies that cause how we perpetuate racism in today's society. And we've heard a lot of recent media coverage on this topic, and we will revisit it later on in the semester. We then have American sociologists, which came out of the Chicago School. Early American sociology really became prominent at the University of Chicago, leading to this movement to be called the Chicago School. And they focused on empirical research with the belief that people's behaviors and personalities are shaped by the social and physical environment. And so empirical research meaning observation of relationship between factors um, and how they interact. They introduced the concept of double consciousness, a concept that Du Bois introduced and refers to individuals' constant awareness of how others perceive them and how those perceptions alter their own behavior. Remember, previously I mentioned that our social identities are not just shaped by our own internal beliefs, but are reinforced by other people's understanding of what our social identity is. This is where double consciousness comes into play, and these two are very closely related. Dubois was the first African American to earn a PhD from Harvard and founded the second American Sociology Department at Atlanta University. Other American sociologists that we'll talk about later on, um, coming out of the Chicago School, include Herbert Mead, Burton Cooley, and Jane Addams, the first American woman to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. Sorry, apologize for that typo. She extensively contributed to the field of social work and co-funded the Whole House, a large settlement house in Chicago. Now that we've talked about some of these founding members and key figures in sociology, which, by the way, you should be familiar with who they are and what their primary concepts are, we'll talk about sociology and its cousins or related disciplines. So while sociology focuses on making comparisons across cases or individuals or groups of individuals to find patterns and create hypotheses about how societies worked in the past, other fields take on a different approach. For instance, history and anthropology tend to focus more on particular circumstances. Um, Though in cultural anthropology in particular, there can be a lot of overlap with sociology. So with history and anthropology, not necessarily um, studying these behaviors and these roles in order to make hypotheses, but we just kind of take things as they are. On the other side, psychology and biology both examine phenomena at a more micro level, at the individual, rather than at the broader level that sociology does. Finally, you have political science, which focuses on one aspect of social relations, and that's power. Um, Political science being an entirely quantitative discipline. I'm sorry, I take that back. This is also a typo. Political science is not an entirely quantitative discipline. Rather, it is economics, which is not included in here. Economics being one of the cousins of sociology, and that is a field that is entirely quantitative an entirely quantitative discipline. These distinctions are important, but it's also important to keep in mind that a lot of overlap exists between the work that these disciplines conduct, and there's often collaboration across across experts in these disciplines. Okay, now thinking about some key sociological theories that we should understand, and I cannot emphasize the importance of this section enough. So a theory is a way of understanding or a way of explaining social phenomena. It's neither true nor false. We typically use empirical research or observation of phenomena of situations to either support or deny a theory. We'll learn more about this in chapter 2. But microsociology is a key theory that understands local contexts, focusing on face to face encounters and gathering data through participant observations and in depth interviews. So, sociologists might be interested in knowing how an individual makes a decision to go to college. That's an example of a microsociological approach, just focusing on an individual and what leads to certain behaviors, certain decisions. Microsociology, on the other side, looks at dynamics across whole societies or large groups of people. For example, if a sociologist wanted to know how many people made the decision to go to college last year and what was determinant of their decision, it would be impossible to find out by sitting down with one person and interviewing them. Rather, you would have to sit down with multiple people with a large sample of people and get data, get information from them, which then you can statistically analyze, or if it's qualitative data, you can analyze using qualitative methods to understand on a more macro level what contributes to individuals going to a university, and then you can apply these findings to larger groups of people depending on your sampling technique and other methodological considerations, which we will cover in chapter 2. Some modern sociological theories include functionalism, which is an example of a macro sociological theory, conflict theory, which is also an example of a macro. Um, Feminist theory, usually macro, although it could be micro as well. Symbolic interactionism is a micro theory. Postmodernism can be both. And then mid range theory, which, as the name suggests, can be somewhere in the middle of both. In this class specifically, we'll be focusing on functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionism. And we will do that in more depth later on, but here is an introduction to them. So, functionalism, which Herbert Spencer is known for, um, emphasizes the way parts of a society are structured to maintain stability and order. So, Herbert Spencer, his major contribution was an evolutionary perspective of social order and social change. He compares society to biological organisms with interrelated parts that work to ensure stability and survival of an entire society. So, thinking back to, let's say, a herd of animals. there are definitely social structures within that herd. And the goal of this social structure is to make sure that the herd itself is able to survive. So really, stability and order of the herd is critical for that survival, and that's what functionalism emphasizes. Um, in this perspective, society is viewed as a network of connected parts, each of which helps to maintain a system as a whole. Society consists of interrelated parts like organs of the body, you can think of, that serve functions, roles, and need to be and are needed to be part of a larger system or an organism. And so societies can develop social structures or institutions that persist because they play a part in helping society survive. Remember that social structures, social institutions can be changed throughout time. They are not static, and this is where functionalism plays a role. If it is not serving its purpose of stability and order, then social institutions can change. However, if they are serving that function and they maintain some sort of stability and order, they tend to last longer and go on. Um, Examples of these institutions include family, education, government, religion, economy. Um, as an example, you could think of a government from a functionalist perspective. If a government is not meeting the needs of the people that make it up, of the people that live within that government, then there is intrinsically just the need for some change in the structure of that government. That is a functionalist perspective. The most basic assumption of the perspective is that society is a stable, orderly system characterized by social consensus. If that consensus is threatened, there's adverse consequences um, that lead to changes in that particular area of the society. And so I mentioned Herbert Spencer. Durkheim, who we talked about earlier, was also um, one associated with functionalism. We have Talcott Parsons and Robert Merton. Parsons stressed that all societies must make provisions for meeting social needs in order to survive. Again, if those needs are not met, then the society's probability of surviving and moving on as an institution is threatened. For example, a division of labor between husband and wife is essential for family stability and social order. Husbands or fathers perform instrumental tasks that involve leadership, decision making, and employment outside the home. Wives and mothers perform expressive tasks that involve housework, caring for children, provisional emotional support to the family. Now, these are outdated conceptions of what being a wife, being a husband, being a male, female, in a heterosexual relationship means. But you kind of get the gist that different members of this one unit have different tasks that they must perform in order for the unit as a whole to move forward. Merton further refined the functionalist perspective. He distinguished among manifest functions, latent functions, and dysfunctions of institutions. Manifest functions are intended to overly and are overly recognized by participants in an institution. Latent functions are unintended functions that are hidden and remain unacknowledged. Those are not recognized, but they do play a role in the back, if you will. And then dysfunctions are the undesired consequences of any element of society. So typically, we want we don't want dysfunctions to affect society or the social group, and that is the role that Robert Merton emphasized from the functionalist perspective. We then have conflict theory, and conflict theory assumes that social behavior is better understood in terms of tension between groups over power or allocation of resources. This can include factories, food, housing, wealth, jobs, education, leisure time, just natural resources. For example, if we want to think on a more macro level, uh, country to country example, colonialism being an example that's coming to mind now with conflict theory. The theory considers how status quo is established and maintained, and who benefits and suffers from the existing system. Now, this is reminiscent of Marx's, Weber's ideology, and in fact, they are some of the theorists that are associated with conflict theory. The most basic assumption of conflict perspectives is that groups with divergent interests engage in ongoing power struggles for control of scarce resources in society. Much of what we consider conflict theory today is attributed to Marx and his ideas about the conflict between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat classes. Apart from these economic classes, we also look at the differences from the perspectives of gender, race, immigration status, so on and so forth, other social roles that individuals might have. The feminist perspectives and critical race theories look at social issues through these lenses, and they're probably two of the most widely known, widely recognized conflict theories that we know. So, in addition to Marx, Weber also is associated with conflict theory, and Weber recognized the importance of economic conditions in producing inequality, like we mentioned before. He defined power as the ability of a person to carry out his or her will despite resistance from others, and prestige as a positive or negative estimation of honor. Finally, we have Mills, who introduced the sociological imagination, and he believed that the power elite, a small group composed of the top corporate, political, and military officials, you can think of that one top 1%, makes the most important decisions in the United States largely behind scenes, and others, the large majority, are just kind of playing by those rules that the elite are making up. Then we have, oh, actually, along with conflict theory, the feminist perspectives is another one that I want to highlight. Um, and the feminist perspective direct our attention to women's experiences and the importance of gender as an element to social structure. The basic assumption is that men and women are equal and should be given equal rights. Feminist perspectives also assume that we live in a patriarchy or a system in which men dominate women, and the masculine characteristics are more highly valued um, in our society. Feminist perspectives believe that society reinforces social expectations through social learning, which is acquired through major social institutions. Remember, institutions dictate how individuals that make it up should interact. And so, with the feminist perspective, this example of a conflict theory, um, societies reinforce social expectations where these male characteristics are more desired and female characteristics less so. Conflict theorists focus on how inequalities based on gender or sex can affect how people can acquire things and how they move throughout. Then we have symbolic interactionism. And that is the conflict and functionalist perspectives are often criticized for their emphasis on the larger societal structures and their lack of focus on what happens between individuals. And so this is where symbolic interactionism comes in. And it generalizes about everyday forms of social interaction in order to explain society as a whole. So this is a micro level theory, whereas functionalism and conflict theory are more macro level theories thinking of society on a wider lens, a wider perspective. So shared symbols, signs, and language make up the reality of society. That is what symbolic interactionism emphasizes. And so, for example, as a society, we have agreed upon the idea that red traffic lights means that no one needs to stop their vehicle, that one needs to stop their vehicle. And green light means that you can go. Another example of this is, for example, in the US and most countries, I believe, we drive on the right side of the road. There are some countries like India, South Africa, the UK, where they drive on the left. Now, this is a completely arbitrary rule that we as a society, as an institution of countries, decided, and we stick to these rules. Um, we either drive on the right or drive on the left, depending on the country. And not only are these rules, but these are laws. And we'll talk more about this as the semester goes on. But it really becomes critical once the roles, expectations that are associated with an institution, in this example being a country, they can become laws that are punished, that can be punished if you break them. So this thing that's as arbitrary as we're going to drive on the right or the left, as a society, we came together, we decided which one was correct, and anyone who violates that is violating a law and can be punished. And so, some key theorists of symbolic interactionism are Herbert Mead and Irvin Goffman. And Mead was a founder of the micro-level analysis, who emphasized that a key feature distinguishing humans from other animals is the ability to communicate in symbols. For example, a red light. Symbols are anything that meaningfully represent something else. Symbols must be interpreted in the same way by individuals within the society to produce a shared reality. Again, a traffic light, red, we all know what that means. There's a consensus um, between us, between our society, that we stop at a red light. And Mead really emphasized that identity results from the symbolic interactions with others. Um, Coming back to this yet again, our social identity not only depends on our understanding of it, but the reinforcement, the understanding that others have, and that just support our notions and conceptions of who we are, what our identity is. On the other side, Goffman developed the idea of dramaturgical analysis, which makes an analogy between social life and that of a stage. I was referring to this earlier, where I said that a social institution can be like a play where we have actors, actresses that play certain roles, and they make up what is the play as a whole. But these different members of this society or this play have their roles um, that they perform and that they are expected to perform. This is also reminiscent of functionalism, where that stability and order, in order for the play to be successful, to play out okay, different interrelated parts or individuals need to be involved. Okay, and finally, we are moving on to divisions in sociology. I believe we already mentioned interpretive sociology, but really want to emphasize that interpretive sociology focuses on the meanings people attach to social phenomena, prioritizing specific situations over a search for social facts that transcend time and place. Um, and positivist sociology, which we also talked about earlier, and where was it? Okay, yeah. You see, Comte introduced positive sociology, and as you can see, it is still a leading division within sociology. And with that perspective, or the normal science model of sociology, we attempt to reveal the social facts that affect social life by developing and testing hypotheses based on theories about how the social world works. This would be taking an empirical approach to sociology where we observe relationships um, and based on past behaviors or past observations, we can then make predictions, form hypotheses that can be either supported or refuted through the collection of data in some sort. Then we have micro sociology and macro sociology, which we also covered. And micro sociology being focused on the interactional context, focusing more on face to face encounters and gathering data through participant observation and in depth interviews of a few select number of people. Macro sociology, on the other end, looks at the social dynamics across whole societies and really focuses on mass collection of data, mass observation, rather than at the individual level. Now, that is the end of our lecture for today. Just 1 second. So, thank you for listening in. Now that you have a lecture, that you've read through the materials, you can go ahead and take the quiz, which remember is not graded. You'll have up to 3 chances to then take individual activity number 1. Individual activity number 1 is due tomorrow, the 3rd, by 11:59. Um, I'm sorry it's due on a Friday, and that is why I encourage you to work on those activities right after class today. Let myself and Jayla know if you have any questions, and I will see you next time.